The California sun was setting behind the private hangars of Los Angeles International Airport, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple. It had been another packed day for Shaquille O'Neal, the kind that would leave most people exhausted and ready to call it quits. But Shaq wasn't most people. Despite back-to-back meetings with business partners, a 3-hour video shoot for his latest commercial, and a quick stop at his son's basketball game, his energy remained as vibrant as ever. His custom-designed Mercedes SUV smoothly turned into the private aviation terminal's entrance. The vehicle, specially modified to accommodate his 7-own frame, drew the usual admiring glances from people around the parking lot. Through the tinted windows, Shaq could see the usual bustle of the private terminal, flight crews walking briskly across the tarmac, ground staff directing smaller aircraft, and the occasional celebrity trying to slip in unnoticed through the VIP entrance. As he pulled into his reserved parking spot, Shaq checked his phone one last time. 3 unread messages from his producer in New York reminded him why he was here. Tomorrow morning, he was scheduled to appear on a major morning show to announce a new initiative that would help underprivileged kids get into sports and education. It was the kind of project that made all his business success meaningful. A chance to give back and make a real difference. The airport staff had always known Shaq as one of their most down-to-earth clients. Unlike many celebrities who demanded special treatment, he always took time to chat with the maintenance crew, joke with the flight dispatchers, and remember personal details about their lives. Tonight was no different. As he stepped out of his SUV, he waved at Chen, the parking attendant who had been working there for over a decade. "Hey, big man." Chen called out with a genuine smile. "Heading to New York again?" "You know it," Shaq replied, giving Chen their usual fist bump. "How's your daughter doing in college?" Chen's face lit up. "Just made the dean's list. Thanks for asking." These small interactions were what Shaq lived for. Despite his massive success, 4 NBA championships, a successful business empire, and countless endorsement deals, he never forgot the importance of treating everyone with respect. His mother had taught him that lesson early in life, and it had stuck with him through all the fame and fortune. Walking towards the terminal entrance, Shaq adjusted his perfectly tailored navy blue suit. Even after years of custom clothing, it still amazed him how tailors managed to make suits that fit his unique frame so well. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand, a gift from his business partners after closing a major deal last month. Inside were the documents for tomorrow's announcement and a tablet containing the presentation he'd been working on during the day. The private terminal was quieter than usual at this hour. Most of the day's flights had already departed, leaving only a few late-night travelers like himself. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see his private jet waiting on the tarmac. The sleek Gulfstream G650, customized with his personal logo on the tail, was being prepared for the cross-country flight to New York. The familiar faces of his flight crew were visible as they conducted their pre-flight checks. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Thompson had been flying with him for years, and he trusted them completely. He could see Lisa, his regular flight attendant, arranging things inside the cabin. She always remembered to stock his favorite healthy snacks and the specific brand of water he preferred. As Shaq approached the security checkpoint, he noticed something different. Instead of Tom, the friendly security guard who usually worked the evening shift, there was an unfamiliar face at the desk. The new guard seemed to be intently focused on his computer screen, not looking up even as Shaq's impressive shadow fell across his desk. The basketball legend reached for his identification, a routine he had performed countless times before. His mind was already on tomorrow's presentation, the excited faces of the kids who would benefit from his new program, the questions he would need to answer during the TV interview, and the potential partners he hoped to bring on board. Little did he know that this routine evening was about to take an unexpected turn. The new security guard was about to challenge not just his right to board his own jet, but also his dignity as a human being. However, what would unfold over the next hour would become a powerful story of grace under pressure, wisdom in the face of ignorance, and the ability to transform a moment of hatred into an opportunity for understanding. The private terminal's lobby had gone oddly quiet. The usual sounds of rolling luggage and quiet conversations had died down, as if everyone sensed the tension that was about to unfold. The setting sun cast long shadows through the terminal's windows, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for what was about to become a memorable evening at Los Angeles International Airport. In his pocket, Shaq's phone buzzed again, probably another message from his New York team about tomorrow's schedule. But for now, that would have to wait. Sometimes life had other plans, and as Shaq had learned throughout his journey from a young basketball player to a global icon, these unexpected moments often carried the most important lessons. The security guard finally looked up from his computer screen, his eyes barely concealing a flash of prejudice that Shaq had seen too many times before. Despite Shaq's immaculate suit and professional demeanor, the guard's expression hardened, as if he already made up his mind about who stood before him. ID and clearance, the guard demanded sharply, not bothering with the courtesy of a greeting. His nameplate read Officer Wilson, though his attitude was anything but professional. He drummed his fingers on the desk, making it clear that he considered this an inconvenience. Shaq maintained his characteristic warm smile, reaching into his jacket pocket for his credentials. He'd learned long ago that responding to negativity with positivity often dissolved tension. The leather wallet he pulled out contained his pilot-approved ID, clearance documents, and ownership papers for the jet, all standard items he carried for private air travel. "Here you go, sir," Shaq said pleasantly, sliding the documents across the desk. "I'm heading to New York tonight. Beautiful evening for flying, isn't it?" The guard barely glanced at the documents before pushing them back. These could be fake. Anyone can get fancy papers made these days. His voice carried a tone that made several nearby staff members shift uncomfortably. "You expect me to believe that's your private jet out there?" A young baggage handler who had been walking by stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in disbelief at what he was hearing. Everyone at the airport knew Shaq, his generosity, his kindness, his regular presence at this very terminal. The handler looked like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should intervene. "I understand your concern for security," Shaq replied calmly, his voice steady and measured. "Would you like to call your supervisor to verify my credentials?" "I'm happy to wait." He'd faced similar situations before, though rarely at this airport where he was a regular client. The guard stood up, trying to use his height to intimidate, a laughable gesture given Shaq's towering frame. "Listen here, I don't care who you think you are. You don't just walk in here claiming to own a multi-million-dollar jet. For all I know, you could be trying to pull something." The terminal had grown eerily quiet. A couple waiting nearby had stopped their conversation to watch. A flight attendant from another private jet stood frozen, her phone half raised, as if debating whether to record what was happening. Shaq took a deep breath, remembering his mother's words from years ago. "Your response to ignorance shows more about your character than their actions show about theirs." He could feel his pulse quickening, not from anger, but from disappointment that even in 2024, such encounters were still possible. "Officer Wilson," Shaq began, his voice carrying the same warmth he used when speaking to young basketball players he mentored. "I've been flying out of this terminal for over 15 years. My jet has been stationed here for the past decade. I'm not just a client, I'm a stakeholder in this aviation company." The guard scoffed, his prejudice now fully visible. "Right, and I'm the King of England. Listen, buddy, why don't you just turn around and—" "Is there a problem here?" A voice cut through the tension. An older maintenance worker named Joe, who had known Shaq for years, had approached the desk. His weathered face showed concern as he assessed the situation. The guard turned to Joe, his voice sharp. "This is a security matter. Please step back." But Joe stood his ground, his decades of service giving him the confidence to speak up. "Sir, with all due respect, that's Mr. O'Neill. He's not just a client, he's part owner of this facility. I've worked here for 20 years, and he's one of the most respected people who comes through these doors." The guard's expression flickered for a moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I don't care if he's the president himself. Without proper verification, nobody gets through." Shaq noticed a small crowd gathering at a respectful distance. Some were recording on their phones, others whispering in disbelief. He knew this moment could go viral for all the wrong reasons. But more importantly, he saw an opportunity, not for confrontation, but for education. Reaching into his briefcase, Shaq pulled out his tablet. "Officer Wilson, would you mind if I showed you something? It's the presentation I'm flying to New York to deliver tomorrow." It's about breaking down barriers and challenging our preconceptions about others. The guard hesitated, caught off guard by this unexpected response. Before he could reply, the clicking of dress shoes on the terminal's floor announced the arrival of more people. The airport's general manager was hurrying toward them, along with 2 other security supervisors. But Shaq hadn't finished his thought. Even as the management approached, he continued speaking to the guard, his voice gentle but firm. You know, every time something like this happens, we have 2 choices. We can let it divide us further, or we can use it as a chance to understand each other better. I've found that the second option usually leads to better places. The terminal remained hushed, watching the scene unfold. Here was one of the most successful athletes and businessmen in the world, being subjected to blatant discrimination, yet responding with a grace and wisdom that would soon turn this ugly moment into something unexpectedly transformative. The general manager had almost reached them now, his face a mix of horror and embarrassment at what was transpiring. But before he could intervene, Shaq would demonstrate why he was not just a basketball legend, but a true leader in every sense of the word. Ana Martinez had worked at the private terminal for 8 years, and she'd seen plenty of celebrities come and go. But something about this evening felt different. She was finishing up some paperwork at her desk near the security checkpoint when she heard the guard's hostile tone. Looking up, she immediately recognized the tall figure of Shaquille O'Neal, someone who had always treated every staff member like family. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. In her 8 years at the airport, she'd never felt compelled to record anything, but something in her gut told her this moment needed to be documented. Not for social media or attention, but because sometimes bearing witness was a responsibility. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself, positioning her phone discreetly while pretending to check her messages. The terminal's evening light cast long shadows across the scene, and she could clearly hear every word of the exchange. Through her phone screen, she watched as Shaq handled the situation with remarkable patience. She'd seen him dozens of times before, playing with kids who recognized him in the terminal, helping elderly passengers with their bags, even once staying late to help the cleaning staff when a storm had left them short-handed. That was the real Shaq, not just the basketball star or businessman, but a genuine human being who cared about others. Anna's supervisor, Mr. Thompson, was in a meeting upstairs. Her fingers moved quickly over her phone's keypad, sending him an urgent message. "Need you at main security checkpoint now. Guard harassing Mr. O'Neal. Situation serious." While waiting for a response, she noticed other staff members gathering quietly around the edges of the scene. There was Carlos from baggage handling, who had once mentioned how Shaq had helped pay for his mother's medical bills. Near him stood Mrs. Clark from the coffee shop, who often talked about how Shaq never forgot to ask about her grandchildren. The guard's voice grew louder, making Anna wince. She'd seen discrimination before, subtle looks, dismissive tones, unnecessary questions. But this was different. This was blatant, unapologetic prejudice happening right in front of her eyes. Her phone buzzed. Mr. Thompson had responded, "On my way. Keep recording. Getting GM2." Anna's mind wandered to her own experiences with discrimination. As a Hispanic woman, she'd faced her share of prejudiced assumptions. She remembered how alone she'd felt in those moments, how much it would have meant if someone had stood up for her. Through her phone screen, she could see the small details others might miss. The way Shaq kept his hands visible and his movements slow and deliberate, despite being the victim of discrimination. The slight tremble in his briefcase-holding hand, not from fear, but from controlled emotion. The way other passengers tried to pretend they weren't watching while unable to look away. "You should be ashamed," she heard Mrs. Clark mutter under her breath, directed at the guard. The older woman's face showed the kind of righteous anger that came from decades of witnessing similar injustices. Anna zoomed her phone's camera slightly, capturing the guard's nameplate clearly, not for revenge, but for accountability. She noticed how the guard's body language screamed insecurity, his too straight posture, his slightly trembling fingers as he tried to maintain his authority against someone he should have recognized and respected. The terminal's usual sounds had faded into background noise, the distant rumble of jets, the soft hum of air conditioning, the quiet beeping of security scanners. All focus was on this moment, this intersection of prejudice and patience, of ignorance and dignity. Anna's free hand clutched her desk as she heard the guard's tone grow more aggressive. She'd been raised to respect authority, but also to recognize when authority was being abused. Her father, a former civil rights activist, had taught her that documentation was a form of peaceful resistance. Through her lens, she captured something extraordinary. The way Shaq tried to turn this ugly moment into a teaching opportunity. She heard him mention his presentation about breaking down barriers, saw him reach for his tablet despite the guard's hostility. It was the kind of moment that reminded her why she'd always admired him beyond his athletic achievements. Other phones had appeared now, held by passengers and staff alike. Everyone seemed to sense the importance of this moment, not as gossip or scandal, but as a testament to how grace could face down prejudice. Anna noticed the young intern from the flight planning office looking particularly affected. The girl's eyes were wide, taking in a real-world lesson about standing up against discrimination that no training session could ever teach. The sound of rapid footsteps drew her attention. Through the phone screen, she saw Mr. Thompson and the general manager approaching, their faces set with determination. Anna kept recording, knowing that what happened next would be just as important as what had already transpired. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply bear witness. As she steadied her phone, Anna realized she wasn't just recording an incident, she was documenting a moment that would show others how to face discrimination with dignity and how sometimes the strongest response to hatred was unwavering grace. The evening sun caught Shaq's face as he continued speaking calmly to the guard, and Anna made sure to capture this too, not the confrontation anymore, but the transformation that was about to begin. Because sometimes the most important stories weren't about the conflict itself, but about how we chose to resolve it. As tension filled the terminal, Shaq reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, maintaining eye contact with Officer Wilson. Instead of showing anger or frustration, his face held a calm determination that made everyone watching lean in slightly closer. "Let me make a quick call," Shaq said, his voice steady and controlled. He pulled out his phone, its screen lighting up with more messages from his New York team. But those would have to wait. Right now, he had a more important situation to handle. The guard crossed his arms, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, now you're going to call someone important? Go ahead." His sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. Shaq didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he pulled up a contact and pressed the call button, putting it on speaker. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Mr. O'Neill, what can I do for you this evening?" The cheerful voice belonged to Mr. Richards, the CEO of the private aviation company that operated the terminal. "Hey Bob, sorry to bother you so late," Shaq replied, his voice warm and friendly despite the circumstances. "I'm at the terminal trying to catch my flight to New York, but we seem to have a situation here with security clearance." The guard's smirk began to fade as he listened to the conversation. Around them, the small crowd of onlookers had grown silent, hanging on every word. Security clearance. Mr. Richards sounded confused. "But you're a part owner of the company. Your clearance is permanent. Who's giving you trouble?" Shaq glanced at the guard's nameplate again. "I'm speaking with Officer Wilson. He's new here, and I respect that he's trying to do his job thoroughly. But I think we need some verification of my credentials." The guard's face had begun to pale slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. His crossed arms dropped to his sides, and he shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Officer Wilson." Mr. Richards's voice took on a different tone. "Put him on the phone, please." Shaq held the phone out to the guard, who now looked like he wished the ground would open up and swallow him whole. With a slightly trembling hand, he took the phone. "Sir." His voice had lost all its previous arrogance. What followed was a one-sided conversation that made the guard's face grow increasingly ashen. The others in the terminal couldn't hear Mr. Richards's words, but they could see their effect. Officer Wilson's "yes, sir," and "no, sir" responses grew quieter with each passing moment. During this exchange, Shaq didn't gloat or show any satisfaction at the guard's discomfort. Instead, he used the moment to turn to the gathered crowd, giving reassuring smiles to the worried staff members he knew so well. He caught the eye of the young coffee shop worker who'd served him countless times before. The boy looked upset by what he'd witnessed, but Shaq gave him a gentle nod that seemed to say, "It's okay. This is how we handle these situations." The guard handed the phone back to Shaq, his hand visibly shaking now. "Mr. O'Neill, I didn't." But before he could stammer out an apology, the terminal's main doors burst open. The general manager rushed in, followed by two security supervisors. Their faces showed they'd been briefed on the situation, and they weren't happy. Turn that into something positive, Shaq thought to himself, remembering his mother's wisdom about transforming negative energy into opportunities for growth. He'd learned this lesson on the basketball court, in business, and in life. Sometimes the best plays weren't about scoring points, but about changing the game entirely. He looked at his watch. His flight to New York was scheduled to leave in 40 minutes. The presentation he was supposed to give tomorrow was about breaking down barriers and creating opportunities for understanding between different communities. As he stood there, watching the general manager approach with an apologetic expression, Shaq realized that sometimes the best teaching moments came from real-life situations rather than prepared speeches. The terminal had grown so quiet you could hear the distant rumble of jets taking off. Everyone waited to see how this would play out. Would the guard be fired on the spot? Would there be a scene? Would Shaq demand compensation or public apology? But Shaq had other plans. In his mind, he was already forming an idea, a way to turn this moment of confrontation into something more meaningful. He'd faced discrimination before, but each time, he'd tried to handle it in a way that would make his mother proud. Before anyone says anything, Shaq spoke up, his voice carrying across the now-silent terminal. "I'd like to suggest something different." He turned to face Officer Wilson directly, seeing not just a prejudiced guard, but someone who might need the very thing Shaq was flying to New York to talk about, an opportunity for change. The general manager stopped mid-stride, surprised by Shaq's intervention. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the security supervisors paused, their disciplinary speeches dying on their lips as they witnessed something unexpected unfolding before them. In that moment, as the evening sun cast long shadows through the terminal's windows, Shaq prepared to demonstrate why he was not just a basketball legend or successful businessman, but a true leader who understood that sometimes the biggest victories came from transforming enemies into allies. The general manager of the airport terminal, Mr. Henderson, moved through the crowd with quick steps, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and concern. Behind him, the two security supervisors looked equally uncomfortable, their badges glinting under the terminal's lights as they approached the scene. "Mr. O'Neill," Mr. Henderson called out, slightly out of breath from his rush down from the top floor. "I can't begin to tell you how sorry we are about this situation." His voice carried clearly across the now-silent terminal, where every eye was fixed on the unfolding scene. Officer Wilson stood rooted to his spot, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. The security desk that had been his position of authority just moments ago now felt like a witness stand. His hands, which had so confidently pushed away Shaq's credentials earlier, now hung limply at his sides. Mr. Henderson turned to address the guard directly, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Officer Wilson, do you have any idea who Mr. O'Neill is to this facility?" The guard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I just learned he's a client." "A client?" Mr. Henderson's laugh was hollow. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a glossy brochure, the kind they gave to potential high-end customers. He opened it to the first page, where the board of directors was listed. There, among the photos, was Shaq's familiar smile. "Mr. O'Neill isn't just a client. He's one of our primary stakeholders. He owns 15% of this entire operation." The crowd gathered in the terminal let out a collective gasp. Even some of the regular staff members hadn't known the full extent of Shaq's involvement with the facility. The young coffee shop worker who'd served Shaq countless times looked at him with newfound amazement. Officer Wilson's face had turned an ashen gray. The reality of his actions, questioning and disrespecting not just a celebrity, but one of the company's owners, hit him like a physical blow. His legs seemed to wobble slightly, and he had to grip the edge of the security desk for support. "Not only that," Mr. Henderson continued, his voice rising with emotion, "but Mr. O'Neill was instrumental in funding our employee education program last year. The same program that paid for your training, Officer Wilson." This revelation caused several staff members to cover their mouths in shock. A cleaning lady in the corner wiped tears from her eyes. Her daughter had been one of the beneficiaries of that education program. Shaq watched the scene unfold with a measured expression. He'd never been one to flaunt his ownership or influence. In fact, many of his contributions to the facility and its staff had been made quietly, without fanfare or publicity. His mother had always taught him that true generosity didn't need an audience. The security supervisors stepped forward, ready to take action, but Shaq raised his hand slightly, a gesture that somehow commanded more authority than any loud voice could have. "Mr. Henderson," Shaq spoke, his deep voice calm and measured, "before any decisions are made, I'd like to share something with Officer Wilson." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out his tablet, the same one that contained his presentation for tomorrow's event in New York. The guard looked up, confusion mixing with the shame on his face. He clearly expected to be fired on the spot, possibly even escorted out by his own colleagues. Instead, the man he had discriminated against was asking to speak with him. Mr. Henderson hesitated, clearly torn between his respect for Shaq and his desire to handle the situation officially. "Mr. O'Neill, you don't need to." "But I want to," Shaq interrupted gently. "You see, what happened here tonight? It's exactly what I'm flying to New York to talk about. Sometimes the best teaching moments come when we least expect them." The terminal had grown so quiet you could hear the distant rumble of planes taking off. The evening sun cast long shadows across the floor, creating an almost theatrical setting for this moment of truth. Staff members who had been ready to leave for the day stood rooted to their spots, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Shaq's private jet sat waiting on the tarmac, its engines silent. The pilot had stepped out of the cockpit and was watching the scene unfold from the top of the air stairs, having been informed of the delay. Officer Wilson stood there, his navy blue uniform suddenly seeming too large for his frame. The badge that had given him such confidence earlier now felt heavy on his chest. His eyes darted between Shaq, Mr. Henderson, and the security supervisors, trying to understand how his actions had led to this moment. "Would you like to know what this company really means to me?" Shaq asked, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to embrace everyone in the terminal. "Why I chose to invest here. Why I believe in this place and its people." The guard nodded numbly, unable to form words. Around them, the crowd leaned in slightly, eager to hear what would come next. Even Mr. Henderson, despite his earlier anger, seemed captivated by the turn of events. What happened next would transform this moment of shame and confrontation into something none of them expected. A lesson in humanity that would resonate far beyond the walls of this private terminal. Instead of public humiliation or immediate termination, Shaq did something that surprised everyone in the terminal. He gestured toward a quiet corner where several comfortable waiting chairs sat empty, away from the crowd's eager ears. "Officer Wilson, would you mind sitting with me for a few minutes?" His voice was gentle, lacking any trace of anger or resentment. The guard looked at his supervisors uncertainly, then back at Shaq before nodding slowly. The general manager started to protest, but Shaq held up a hand. "Trust me on this one, Bob. Sometimes the best solutions don't come from punishment." The wisdom in his voice made everyone stop and listen. As they walked to the corner, their footsteps echoing in the hushed terminal, Shaq's massive frame made the guard look small in comparison. Yet there was nothing intimidating about his presence now, only a sense of purpose and understanding. They sat down in the leather chairs, angled slightly toward each other. The guard's hands were trembling as he adjusted his uniform, his eyes fixed on the floor. The crowd maintained a respectful distance, but their attention remained fixed on this unexpected development. "You know," Shaq began, his voice low enough that only the guard could hear clearly, "when I was young, my mom taught me something important. She said that when someone shows you their worst, that's when they need to see your best." The guard looked up, surprise flickering across his face. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected. Shaq continued, opening his tablet to show a series of photos. "See these kids? Tomorrow in New York, I'm launching a program to help them overcome barriers of prejudice, of assumption, of fear. The same kind of barriers we just experienced here." Officer Wilson's face flushed with shame, but Shaq wasn't done. "I faced what you showed me tonight hundreds of times in my life. In stores, at restaurants, even in places where I was an owner or investor. Each time, I had a choice to make." He swiped to another photo on his tablet, This one showing a younger version of himself with his mother. My mom would tell me, "Baby, you're too big to fight with your fists. You have to fight with your heart and your mind." The guard's eyes began to glisten with tears. Around them, the terminal remained eerily quiet, the usual announcements and casual chatter suspended as everyone strained to catch snippets of this extraordinary conversation. "I could demand your job right now," Shaq said matter-of-factly. "I could make sure you never work in security again. But what would that solve? Would it change the thoughts that made you treat me that way? Would it help either of us grow?" A tear rolled down the guard's cheek, which he quickly wiped away. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. I don't know what to say, sir. I was completely wrong about you." Shaq leaned forward slightly. "Not just about me. About how you view people in general. That's what we need to talk about." He pulled up another photo on his tablet, this one showing the terminal's staff during last year's holiday party. In it, people of all backgrounds were smiling together, arms around each other like family. "See this? This is what I invested in, not just a building or a business, but a community. Every person here has a story. Every one of them deserves respect, regardless of how they look or what we assume about them." The guard nodded, really looking at the photo. He recognized some of the faces, people he'd passed in the halls without really seeing them as individuals. "Now," Shaq continued, his voice taking on a more purposeful tone, "we have two paths forward. The easy path is to end your employment and let you go with your prejudices intact. The harder path," he paused, making sure he had the guard's full attention. "The harder path is to learn from this moment and help make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Officer Wilson looked up, confusion mixing with hope in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Shaq said, showing him the presentation he was supposed to give in New York, "that maybe you could help us develop better training for security staff. Share your experience. Help others understand how their assumptions and biases can blind them to the humanity in front of them." The guard's eyes widened as he understood what Shaq was offering, not just forgiveness, but a chance at redemption and growth. "Would you be willing to do that? To turn this mistake into something positive?" Shaq asked, his voice carrying both challenge and encouragement. The terminal held its breath, waiting for the guard's response. Through the windows, the setting sun painted the sky in deep purples and oranges, as if nature itself was providing a backdrop for this moment of transformation. Officer Wilson straightened in his chair, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he met Shaq's eyes directly. His response would determine not just his own future, but potentially impact countless others who might find themselves on either side of such encounters. Officer Wilson stood up from his chair, taking a deep breath before addressing not just Shaq, but the entire terminal. His voice, though shaky at first, grew stronger with each word. "I've been wrong. Not just tonight, but for a long time. Mr. O'Neill, if you're willing to give me that chance, I want to make this right." The terminal remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed. What had started as tension and anger had transformed into something else entirely: hope. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows, painting everything in warm, golden light, as if nature itself was acknowledging this moment of change. Shaq rose from his chair, towering over everyone, yet somehow making each person feel included in this moment. "You know what the hardest part of change is?" he asked, his voice carrying to every corner of the terminal. "It's admitting we need to change in the first place. You've already done that part." The general manager stepped forward, his earlier anger replaced by understanding. "Mr. O'Neill, your flight to New York," he began, gesturing to the waiting jet outside. Shaq glanced at his watch and smiled. Sometimes being a little late is worth it if it means doing something right. He turned to the crowd of airport staff who had witnessed everything. "Everyone here tonight has seen something important. We've seen how hatred can turn to understanding, how mistakes can become opportunities." The young coffee shop worker who had watched everything unfold raised his hand tentatively. "Mr. O'Neill, can I say something?" Shaq nodded encouragingly. The young man stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger. "I've served you coffee almost every week for the past year. You always remember my name, ask about my classes at community college. But I never knew you were an owner here. You never acted like you were better than anyone." Other staff members began nodding in agreement. A maintenance worker spoke up next, his worn hands clutching his work cap. That's right. Last Christmas, when that big storm hit and we were all stuck here, you ordered pizza for the entire night shift. Never mentioned it to anyone, never wanted credit. Officer Wilson listened to these stories, each one hitting him like a gentle wave, washing away more of his prejudices. His face showed the deep impact of realizing how wrong his assumptions had been. Shaq pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Hey, Bob?" "Yeah, I'm going to need to reschedule tomorrow's presentation in New York." He listened for a moment, then smiled. "Actually, I think I have an even better idea. How about we do it right here at the terminal next week? And I've got a new speaker to add to the program." He looked at Officer Wilson, who straightened his uniform unconsciously. "That is, if you're willing to share your story. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from people who've had the courage to change." The guard's eyes welled up with tears, but this time he didn't try to hide them. "I would be honored, sir. And I'm sorry." "I know those words aren't enough, but they're a start." The general manager, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "Mr. O'Neill, what you're doing here, it's remarkable. But how can we make sure this lesson spreads beyond tonight?" Shaq's face lit up with that familiar warm smile. "That's exactly what I was thinking about." He turned to address everyone in the terminal. "Starting next month, we're going to implement a new training program. Not just for security, but for everyone. And it won't be taught by consultants or through videos. It'll be taught by real people sharing real stories." He gestured to Officer Wilson, stories of how we overcame our prejudices, then to the coffee shop worker, stories of everyday kindness, to the maintenance worker, stories of community. A flight attendant who had been recording everything on her phone spoke up. "Sir, this video, would you mind if I shared it? People need to see this." Shaq considered for a moment. "Share it, but not because of me. Share it because tonight we all saw something powerful. We saw that change is possible, that it's never too late to learn and grow." The terminal, which had earlier been a place of confrontation, now felt different. People were talking to each other, sharing their own stories, making connections that had never existed before. Officer Wilson's supervisors approached him, their faces serious but not unkind. "We still need to have a formal review of tonight's events," one said, "but Mr. O'Neill's recommendation will carry a lot of weight." The guard nodded, understanding that actions had consequences, but also that redemption was possible. He turned to Shaq one last time. "Thank you, not just for forgiving me, but for showing me a better way." Shaq placed a gentle hand on the guard's shoulder. "Thank you for being willing to learn. That's all any of us can do. Keep learning, keep growing, keep trying to be better than we were yesterday." As the story of that evening spread across social media in the following days, it wasn't the confrontation that people talked about most. It was the transformation. The comments weren't about anger or shame. They were about hope, about the possibility of change, about the power of responding to hatred with wisdom and understanding. And in that private terminal, something had permanently shifted. The staff walked a little taller, smiled a little more readily, looked a little more closely at their own assumptions and biases. They had witnessed something remarkable, not just a resolution to a conflict, but a demonstration of how wisdom and compassion could transform lives. As Shaq finally boarded his jet that evening, the sunset painting the sky in brilliant colors, he knew that sometimes the most important journeys weren't about reaching a destination. They were about the moments of transformation along the way, the small victories of human understanding that could change hearts and minds, one person at a time.